The sequels are canon, Marco. You must watch the sequels. Watch them. Do it.
Firstly, I want to say that this video is going to have spoilers for pretty much the entire Skywalker saga, so be aware of that. And I just want to start by talking about the prequels and their somewhat disappointing legacy in the Star Wars canon. Now, it's a well-known fact that these are some of the most berated and made fun of movies of all time, and to some extent for good reason. Throughout all three prequel movies, we get some really poorly paced and poorly put together stories. We get janky humor that's meant for 3-year-olds that pretty much no one laughed at, and we get what's quite frankly some of the worst dialogue that's been ever put to film. All of these things combined to make 3 movies that were just really difficult for audiences to enjoy when they first came out, no matter how nostalgic we may feel about them now. And that's pretty much it for me when it comes to criticizing the prequels in this video. I'm not that interested in doing that. There are already plenty of other YouTubers that have done that and beaten that topic to death. What I am interested in doing, however, is saying that even though these movies aren't necessarily really good Star Wars in some places, it's pretty safe to say that they're still Star Wars. They still capture the feel of the universe from the original trilogy when that came out in the 70s and 80s. We know this is true because of how much love people have for this era of Star Wars now. Despite all of his flaws, George Lucas was still able to create a really awesome addition to his original vision with the High Republic era. Now, this included plenty of cool new wars and armies we'd never seen before, lots of unique planets we'd never been to, and not to mention a plethora of awesome, cool new characters that we'd never seen, like the younger version of Obi-Wan Kenobi, Count Dooku, Grievous, Darth Maul, and tons of other ones. And what's really important is that even though all of this wasn't perfectly fleshed out in the prequel movies, George Lucas set the foundation for lots of other awesome content to be created. For example, the original Battlefront 2 video game and the Clone Wars TV show. What I'm really trying to say here is that even though the prequels were really flawed movies, George Lucas was still able to continue his original vision and add to the universe without being overly offensive to the Star Wars lore. Because of this, eventually most fans were able to embrace the positives that came out of the prequels and just kind of ignore the negatives. Unfortunately, the same can't really be said for the sequels. And now, before I get to those movies, I just want to mention that I know that the existence of midichlorians doesn't really support what I just said, but rest assured, I'm going to talk about them later. Now, moving on to the sequels, I think the reason that they're so heavily hated is that they seem to almost viciously attack the original trilogy, especially its lore and characters. And I also want to mention that I also think this, and I have pretty much nothing but disdain for the sequels for this exact reason. Now, I'm going to go through several examples of why the sequels are disrespectful to fans, George Lucas, and the original movies. But first, I want to discuss the notion that the prequels did the same thing, because I'm sure some people do think that. Now, I want to do this by talking about midichlorians, because midichlorians are really one of the most hated things about the prequels. And the reason for that is they did exactly what Star Wars fans hate, and they contradicted the original material by changing the way the Force works. Now, I know that that would appear to hurt my case, but I would challenge you to think about really any other example of the prequels doing this. I personally can't really think of any. The dialogue, for example, although often really poorly written and really wooden, really is pretty harmless, except when the characters are talking about midichlorians. When it comes to the sequels, what we essentially get are 3 movies that are the embodiment of what people didn't like about midichlorians. And now what I'm going to do is go through a few of the most egregious examples of contradiction and disrespect to the sequel trilogy. My first issue is really with the title crawl, or what's in the title crawl of The Force Awakens, and how the whole new trilogy is set up. We essentially get a whole bunch of questions that are crucial to the story and to the saga timeline, but are never answered. We get introduced to the First Order as this new evil regime that's wreaking havoc across the galaxy, but we're never really told what their purpose is or how they were even allowed to form. Also, the very notion that Luke and the rebels were so quickly defeated after their victory in Return of the Jedi makes us question the competence of our heroes from the original trilogy. And now, I'm not saying that I thought there would have been peace forever in the galaxy, but the First Order rose up really quickly and with very little explanation. What's worse is that over the course of the sequel trilogy, our initial fears are confirmed as we're introduced to deadbeat dad Han Solo and hermit Luke Skywalker. This stark shift in several legendary characters and the lack of an explanation of the gap between Return of the Jedi and The Force Awakens is bad enough, but the creators never really even try to justify any of this. That is, besides a few short flashback scenes and lines of dialogue. This is just bad writing. You can't just change everything we know about a universe and its characters without adding any sort of real justification or connective tissue. This extends to things like Rey's absurd ability to use the Force without any training, Holdo's hyperspace trick, Force healing, and plenty of other things. I know this is getting sort of off topic from The Force Awakens, but all of this stems from the opening of that first movie, and by extension the opening of the whole new trilogy. Now let's talk about the cruel butchering of Luke's character in The Last Jedi. Luke makes a full 180 from a brave and heroic man who would sacrifice anything for the people he loves and for the cause that he believes in, to a pathetic hermit that doesn't care about anything. Some people would say that this change is justified because of the flashback that we see where Luke tries to kill Kylo Ren, but this is ridiculous for two reasons. One is that even if you have a flashback or some quick line of dialogue to explain some turn of events, this has significantly less value than if we were to actually see those events unfold. This quick and easy way can work for relatively insignificant things like explaining why some ship or weapon has an ability we haven't seen before, but it doesn't work for explaining major character development. Another reason is that we're expected to believe that Luke Skywalker would try to kill his own nephew after having a bad dream, when we know full well that in the original trilogy, one of his main character traits was his faith in the goodness of other people. This man was willing to go to his death because the most evil and ruthless man in the galaxy, besides maybe the Emperor, could maybe be turned back to the light. This is more than just weak writing. It actually creates a sort of cognitive dissonance in the audience because it's like we're not even watching the same character anymore. And what makes matters worse is that these changes are permanent. But the great thing about the prequels is that they occur before the original trilogy in the Star Wars timeline, making it harder for them to really change all that much about the originals. With the sequels, we now know that even though Luke saved the galaxy and brought Vader back to the light in Return of the Jedi, in The Force Awakens and The Last Jedi, he's just gonna betray himself and lose all of his heroic qualities for basically no reason. And I'm not saying that the original movies aren't fun to watch. They're still great. It's just that it sucks that these awful character changes are canon. The final thing that I want to talk about here is Rey and her relation to all of the original trilogy characters. Now, not only is Rey the Tesla definition of a Mary Sue, but the writers also use her to basically mock and belittle all of the original trilogy characters, as well as Lucas's idea of the Force. For example, Rey is somehow allowed to have a scene where she explains to Han Solo how to fix the Millennium Falcon. Now, I'm not a fan of deifying our heroes and making them out to be perfect, but if there's one thing in the entire galaxy that Han Solo should be able to do, it's fix and take care of the Millennium Falcon. After all, it's at the core of his character. All of this just makes us question Han's competence for no reason. Another example is Rey and Luke's 1v1 duel in The Last Jedi. Now, I know that this scene isn't exactly a fight to the death or anything, but it's just laughable that it would take anything more than a flick of the wrist for Luke to defeat Rey, who is, let me remind you, entirely untrained in any form of lightsaber combat or use of the Force. All this little fight scene does is reinforce the message that this trilogy is trying to convey, that Rey is great at everything without any training or tutelage. Rey's entire character design basically breaks every rule that we know about how a Force user has to train and the abilities that they have, making us question the original trilogy and Luke's training that he underwent in it. And these are just a few of the many examples like them in the sequel trilogy. I just felt compelled to talk about these specific ones. The biggest reason that all of this matters is that the disrespectful way that the creators of the sequels treated Star Wars lore makes it really difficult for avid fans to just throw out the bad stuff and accept the good stuff when watching them, like in the prequels. Given the nature of the mistakes that were made, it's more likely that avid fans will just shut off and get angry rather than try to move past them. For example, seeing the mistreatment of Luke's character just made me feel like the sequels weren't true Star Wars and made me not want to acknowledge any of their positive attributes. To me, the mistakes that these movies make are so plentiful and so disastrous that the good stuff is just insignificant. In the end, the real difference between the two lesser Star Wars trilogies is that one tries to build on the foundation of the original trilogy, while the other one, intentionally or not, tries to chip away at it. Well, guys, that's pretty much it. I could talk about Star Wars and rant about the sequels and how angry they make me forever, but this video should probably be at least a little bit concise. If you guys like this video, maybe check out some of my other analysis stuff and, maybe like and subscribe because movies,
Hey, thanks for watching.